what I'm going to try to do this evening is to look at the change in Henry. You will observe where I have put the terminal date of the lecture. It's in 1533, not 1536, on which a lot of attention, I think very interestingly, has been focused. The claim then is that a certain series of medical consequences of sporting injuries bring about a mental transformation in Henry. As many of you may know, he had two unfortunate accidents in the kind of problem that elderly sportsmen who don't quite keep themselves in trim tend to suffer from. You see them quite often in the pub after the friendly rugger match. You know these. And anyway, Henry came two croppers in early 1536. The first was in jousting when he is unhorsed and falls very heavily. And the general view is it's at this point that he injures his leg in a way which, and the medical, as it were, the actual medical consequences remain in dispute, but he damages his leg in a fashion which leads to chronic ulceration. The type of ulceration is properly known as osteomyelitic, but there are two distinct means by which it can be brought about. One is by an actual splintering of the shin bone, and then the bone splinter. These, remember, are the days before nowadays it would be an elementary X-ray that would sort it out, but the splinter becomes embedded in the calf muscle, which, of course, in Henry's case, as we know from the great Holbein portrait, Henry's calf is a magnificent object, a combination of muscle and fat, maybe padding too, because, of course, gentlemen's calves were much admired. But anyway, it certainly offers enough material once a bone splinter has got into it to produce this chronic ulceration and suppuration. The other possible explanation is simply that it's a sufficiently severe injury to the whole of the lower leg actually to produce a disease of the bone marrow, which even now, I'm told, can lead to amputation if it's not actually dealt with. The other thing is that Henry has a very bad hunting accident and lands on his head in a ditch. The sort of thing that those who don't much like fox hunting always wish on red-coated gentlemen. But anyway, and Henry wasn't wearing a proper hat, clearly, and had to be pulled out feet first. And again, it's argued that this combination of injuries leads to an actual change in Henry's character. Now, I think this is both right and terribly wrong. I think it's right that the sporting injury does lead to a remarkable slowing down of pace. As the ulceration gets worse and worse, you get a vicious cycle. Henry can no longer take exercise in the way that he'd been used to, but he continues to eat and drink as he'd used to, so he gets fatter and fatter. The fatter he gets, any chap here knows what the problem is, and it's one of the reasons we're all told to keep on exercising as we get older. Henry clearly didn't have a healthy, vigorous young Labrador as I do, who takes you frequent walks, and sorts these problems out. So there is that aspect of it, and clearly a bad fall, direct blow effectively on the frontal lobes, can alter character. But, ladies and gentlemen, can this be the actual explanation? This is January 1536. He has already, the previous year, executed Moore, his most long-standing friend, and Fisher. In 1533, he had imposed a shatteringly humiliating divorce on his wife of 20-odd years standing. It seems to me that the changes are much, much earlier, and that to medicalise them, it's a very modern fashion that we medicalise changes. And it seems to me to be fundamentally wrong, and actually, dare I say, to trivialise. It seems to me that the changes in Henry are much deeper, much more fundamental, have a have a genuine ideological component. In other words, that ideas are involved. It's not simply that he has an unfortunate knock to the head. And what I'll be looking at today is this process of change and to try to put it in the broader context of the reign. So that's a kind of preface, so we see why I've chosen dates deliberately. It's, of course, one of the things which so much modern teaching of history gets so badly wrong, that it doesn't anchor things firmly into dates. Dates absolutely matter. Remember, the whole notion of causation depends on one thing coming in front of another. I look at intelligent students, and a sort of vague glimmer of recognition takes several minutes you're all much brighter, of course. A vague glimmer of recognition takes several minutes to come across their faces. A cause has to be anterior to a result. Dates matter. Dates matter vitally. Anyway, so that's why I chose the dates that I did. Let's go back then to the beginning. Let us again, what is also very difficult, and I've fallen into the trap instantly, let us please try now to suspend disbelief and indeed to suspend knowledge for the next few minutes, because, of course, we all know what Henry's going to turn out to be. Contemporaries didn't. And contemporaries were extremely surprised by what happened. Because the Henry they knew, and particularly the Henry that foreigners knew, because, of course, abroad you tend to get an image which is relatively quickly set into people's minds, they were profoundly surprised at the changes, which I think is one of the reasons why, in some ways, his contemporaries and foreign powers react relatively slowly to what Henry was doing, because they were taken by surprise. So let's then look at this young king who comes to the throne, and let's look at how he occupies his time before the change. And remember, once again, it's this trick of history. In the same way, we talk about 6 marriages and tend to think of them idly as being roughly the same. Whereas, of course, Catherine is married to Henry for 20-odd years. Everybody else is bundled into, the period at the end. And some wives are around for a matter of months, or in the case of, Anne of Cleves, barely weeks. And again, remember, nice Henry is half the reign. The king who does everything, the king who imprints himself on our memories, the spot of blood and grease on the history of England, the king who transforms England, all of this is shunted right to the end of the reign. So let's look at the beginning. Now, the Henry who comes to the throne in 1509, as those of you who will know, who've glanced at been around the exhibition, glanced at the catalogue, is already a king who is interested in this question of what do you do when you're a king? Sounds a very odd thing to say, but what's the purpose of being a king? Are you there, just like your father, to stay on the throne and to get rich? Or do you have a bigger purpose? And it seems to me to be very clear, and we have the testimony of Henry's companion in his studies, we call mentor. Erasmus calls him socius studiorum, companion in studies, his mentor, William Blount, Lord Mountjoy. Blount, in the famous letter to Erasmus, says, our king, and here contrasting him with his father, is not after riches and jewels. Instead, his aims are virtue, glory, immortality. And it's something I remember in that Journal of Record, the Radio Times, somebody got very cross with me for introducing the word fame about Henry and sort of said, oh dear, isn't celebrity culture, penetrating into places where really it shouldn't be allowed to go? Ladies and gentlemen, it's not me, it's Henry, it's Erasmus, it's Mountjoy. They're the ones who use the word fame. One of the things that connects the 16th century, and there are so many of them, that connect the 16th century so interestingly with our own age, is their obsession with fame. All that's happened in the late 20th, early 21st century is that we've democratized it. Then fame was something that belonged to the elite. either the cultural elite or the political elite. In the same way, it also belonged to the elite to misbehave. Look at Henry's divorces. Ordinary people couldn't afford to have so much fun. Nowadays, again, thanks to social welfare, we've democratized the right to behave badly, which is, why Social Security bill is 1/3 of government expenditure. Then only the rich could get away with it. We misguidedly, in my view, have democratized it. Well, fame is exactly the same thing. And indeed, occasionally I do this kind of thing, guiding A-level students and undergraduates in writing essays, you could really say that Henry's reign is a series of quests for fame. That he is conscious always that what he wants to do is to be remembered. So he'll be absolutely delighted, as I've said, toasting in the 10th circle of hell, though he may be at the moment. And my, wouldn't he toast nicely? No need to baste. The alleviation of his torments will be the thought that we are all busily talking about him now and arguing about him. You would think that's absolutely terrific. But Henry's, as it were, consciousness of fame, his desire for glory, for reputation. In other words, also remember against his ancestors, to match his ancestors. If you're a king, you see yourself, obviously, as part of a sequence. I think, again, if you're a nobleman, you do exactly the same even now. I mean, the only member of the high aristocracy that I've known really well is Conrad Russell, the Earl Russell, descended on the one hand from Bertram, but also from the Earl Russell who got his premiership at the time of who was Prime Minister and whatever in the wake of the Reform Act and whatever the great and Conrad had this profound awareness of dynasty, of matching. And there was on his wall, a quite modest house, nevertheless, a portrait of the first Earl Russell, John Russell, who was, of course, a courtier of Henry VIII, and it was simply labelled The Founder. That was all it was. It was the founder. So Henry, again, has this sense of matching up to the greatest of his ancestors. And what you could say, if you were doing this undergraduate essay, is that the only issue was how he achieved it. And what you can do is you can really see him going through a whole series of means to the same end. And what I'm going to be talking about this evening are really the succession of these three means. The first is deeply conventional. Remember, the picture that I gave you, I've now forgotten how long ago it is, in that first lecture, which I hope you haven't forgotten completely, those of you who were here, is that Henry is the most deeply conventional of people, with that one exception of the strange upbringing by women. Everything else about Henry, his tastes in literature, his tastes in religion, his tastes in sport, are completely typical. There is nothing unusual about him at all. And when he becomes king, a fortiori, what he wants is the sport of kings. He wants war. War, war, and more war. However, just to give you this quick summary, because with a lecture I think it helps, England quickly discovers that even pillaging the very large amounts of money that Henry VII had left, perhaps £1.5 million, even with a rapidly reformed system of direct taxation, the so-called subsidy, England simply does not have the resources to fight continental war on a continuous basis. So what do? Well, you try this extraordinary experiment, and it is a real experiment, of winning glory through peace. You simply flip. And instead of war, you try to be the dominant diplomatic power of Europe. And for a period of time, because Thomas Wolsey, Henry's great minister, is a pretty impressive conjurer, you keep the trick going. But of course, you find very quickly that in order to dominate, again, it's the old English business of trying to punch above your weight, and it's always mythical. You can't, as anybody knows who's sort of fought opposite Tyson, you can't punch above your weight because you get knocked out by somebody who really does punch with their weight. And England quickly discovers that this game doesn't work. And the argument of this lecture is accidentally, the divorce delivers Henry the fame that he had wanted. And it becomes the most, to 16th century's eyes, the most impressive form of fame, which is the fame of a religious reformer. So what was in fact this infinite crisis in Henry's life, the sign that everything had gone wrong, that his marriage had gone wrong, that he hadn't got an heir, that he'd fallen in love with the wrong person, the thing that contemporaries thought destroyed him, in fact, paradoxically, turns out to be the thing that made him, that forced him to do the thing that is genuinely world historical, to break with Rome and to transform the relations of the English church and the universal church, to transform the position of the monarchy by making the king head of the church and therefore head, as it were, of morality. It's an extraordinary thought, you fuse political and moral agencies and really determine the course of English history directly for 200 years and in fundamental ways right through to the present. But it's accidental, okay? So that's a broad pattern. Let's quickly look then at the engagement in war, then the engagement in peace, and then the extraordinary cascade of changes in that 5-6 crucial years from 1527 to 1533. Henry comes to the throne in April 1509, which of course was why our exhibition opened then and why these events are taking place, exactly 500 years on. He came to the throne, as we forget, in the middle of a huge European crisis. One of the great difficulties now about both the teaching and the studying of history is, when I was a young man, diplomatic history was still alive and well. Well, it was alive, sort of died, because it was just so bloody boring. Nevertheless, it is supremely important. Foreign policy is the supreme area of activity of a king. It's the only area where he deals with his equals, other kings. The actual form of address of monarchs for each other is brother, even when they hate each other. Brother and sister. They are part of a unique tribe to which sovereignty is the passport. So foreign policy is unbelievably important. And Henry comes to the throne at this huge crisis in European policy, which had happened in the last months and weeks of his father's reign. Back in the autumn, the October and the November and early December of 1508, an international congress had assembled at Cambrai, which is now in France, but then was just across the border in the Netherlands, ruled by the Habsburgs, ruled actually by Margaret of Austria on behalf of her young nephew, the future Charles V, with in the background Margaret's father, Charles V's grandfather, the Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of the Romans rather, Maximilian. And it was a meeting between the Archduchess Margaret and the great minister, the Cardinal Minister Legate. Very interesting when you think of Wolsey, the Cardinal Minister Legate of the King of France, Louis XII, Georges d'Amboise. And the meeting between Margaret and Georges d'Amboise had a public purpose and a private purpose. The public purpose is to wage a crusade. The private purpose is for all European powers to come together to destroy the great Republic of Venice. And the attack is launched in April, and it's concluded successfully in early May. So it just comes on either side of Henry's accession. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why the Venetian ambassadors are so interested in England and Henry. Because the only power that can stop France in Italy is England in the north, if England invades. So the whole context of Henry's invasion of France has got to be set, first of all, in this complex interwoven web of European diplomacy, but it's also got to be set against something else. It's got to be set against Henry's own sense of self. And I think there are two aspects to this. The first is that Henry had been brought up to speak French and hate the French. He is a francophone, francophobe. We've already talked about, and I think we have in the exhibition, the French Chronicle, the Chronique de Reims, which tells of the crusade in which Richard II of England and Philip Augustus of France perform all sorts of deeds of daring do in the Holy Land, written, of course, in French. And it would seem that John Skelton, Henry's first tutor, uses this as a teaching aid. But in the margin is written a Latin commentary of the most savage hostility to the French, with lines like, the English clearly won this engagement, but the French, as always, speak with forked tongues. They claim the victory that the English had really won, but then what else do you expect from the French? And it goes on like this, In other words, it's terribly modern. It's a bit like our relations with Scotland, on which I have formed too. So there's. There is then this sense of Henry's deep dislike bred into him by his educational process for the French. And I think what adds to that, of course, is that his father was pro-French. So much of Henry, I think, is that deliberate reaction of one generation to another of son against father. But much bigger, of course, is the issue of ancestry. Both are called Henry. Stretching out behind them are 6 and 7 other Henrys, going right back to Henry I, the last king of the House of Normandy. Where do you look for your model? Henry VII looks for his model to Henry VI, the sainted king. And he spends all his time trying to get Henry VI canonized. And indeed, the intention was that what we call the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster would in fact have, it would be a new grand royal saint. In the same way, I don't know how well you have the arrangements at Westminster imprinted in your mind. It's very important. The great, what's called the theatre, the space in front of the high altar where the coronation takes place, immediately behind the high altar is the founding saint of the English dynasty. That is Edward the Confessor. And then arrayed round Edward the Confessor are the tomb chests of all the great medieval kings. And then at the very end, directly opposite the high altar, at the extreme east end of the church, at the extreme east end of the choir, is the tomb of the greatest medieval king, Henry V, the conqueror of France, showing his double coronation, which didn't actually take place, at least one of them didn't, as King of England, which did take place, but King of France, which didn't take place. And the Henry VII Chapel is then built on directly at that end by the tomb of Henry V, but it was designed to take the tomb of Henry VI, the martyr, the new royal martyr, and the idea would have been then that all the Tudor tomb chests would have gone round there. And Henry VI, I think, Henry VII is very serious about this. He is also very serious about his regard for his grandmother, Queen Catherine of France, that's the mother of Henry VI, who in her widowhood had the affair with Owen Tudor, from which, of course, he springs. So that's where Henry VII's dynastic loyalties lie. Henry VIII shows no interest in any of this at all. No interest in Henry VI. The whole campaign for canonization sort of is put on the back burner in Rome. He, as it were, actively disregards the memory of Queen Catherine, who was a pretty embarrassing woman anyway, and was the direct source of poor Henry VI's madness. And instead, he goes back a generation. He goes back to Henry V. His model of kingship is Henry V. Even when he has the Black Book of the Garter redone and redrawn and re-illustrated, that's the register of the most important order of chivalry, it includes portraits of all the known sovereigns, that's all the known kings of England from Edward III onwards. Most of them are sort of working likenesses. with one extraordinary exception. We all know what Henry V looked like. Well, he looked a bit like Lord Olivier when he's made up, you know. He's got a kind of pudding basin haircut and vaguely sort of agonized expression, you know, and is obviously a kind of, you know, royal sacrifice and all the rest of it. Not a bit of it when you look in the Black Book of the Garter. He is nicely round, full-faced, he wears a Tudor hat, he's got reddish hair and a beard, and is in fact Henry VIII. So you see what I mean? Are you all getting the point? Henry is portraying himself as Henry V. If you're seeing yourself as Henry V, darling, there's only one thing you can do. It's go out and do it. You know, you've got to do your great performance before Agincourt and Harfleur, and what a pity Shakespeare hadn't been written at that point. Otherwise, he'd have known even better what he'd got to do. And one of the things that I've also been able to show, and it's you know, again, it goes back to all of this stuff on Henry's youth. I've actually been able to show that Henry is brought up with direct memories of Henry V. Now, that sounds extraordinary, but Henry's, the man who is the head of his mother's household, the Lord Chamberlain, the Earl of Ormond, is born in, I think it's 1425 or 1428. That's born within, whatever it is, 5 or 6 years of Henry V's death. And a series of memoirs are written recording his memories of Henry V. They've been got completely wrong because there was also an Earl of Ormond who was one of Henry V's companions in the war. And there's been a desperate attempt at saying, but these memoirs can't be very reliable because, you know, the Earl of Ormond wasn't actually with Henry VIII at Harfleur or wherever he was, you know. But in fact, it's not the Earl of Ormond who was a fighting companion. It's the memories of the next generation on, which Henry is familiar with. This man lives from 1425 to 1515. People did live to good ages then, and he keeps his marbles. And I'm absolutely sure that he is the direct source of these memories of Henry V in the circle of the young Henry VIII. So Henry's brought up with all of this. So in a sense, with both the diplomatic situation on the one hand and Henry's appetites for war on the other, it's only a matter of time before he goes and biffs the French. It actually takes a surprisingly long time. It takes nearly 4 years. The reason is very simple. There is major resistance on the part of Henry's council. Although Henry is nominally king, an adult king, there's no regency, that is to say, at the age of 17 years and 10 months, in practice the council behaves as a regency council and countersigns royal decisions and does all this kind of thing. And Henry's leading councillors are his father's leading councillors who've been brought up on this completely different principle that there is no sensible quarrel between England and France. Let's forget all of that stuff. And some of them are already beginning to absorb new doctrines about the fact that war is a bad thing rather than, of course, as every decent gentleman thought, a jolly good one. Remember, it's one of our great cultural ruptures, which is caused essentially by the First World War. Before the First World War, war is generally seen as a good thing, a good and necessary thing. We, of course, nowadays see it as the ultimate awful evil, but that was not how it was seen. The upper classes were a fighting class. Killing class, it's a killing culture. A coat of arms makes you out as a gentleman. Carrying a sword, a killing weapon, marks you out as a gentleman. And you know, the way a gentleman spent his time was killing things. At the bottom of the hierarchy is hunting. Of course, you do it by rules, whether or not you didn't hunt anything as vulgar as a fox in those days. Whether the boar or the stag understood, well, you know, that's their problem. But anyway, it's done by very, very strict rules. And then next, you pretend, though occasionally succeed, in killing human beings. That's called the joust. Again, done very strictly according to rules. And again, like rugby, and everybody has a terribly good time. They're not. I've never understood it, but you know, one of these strange quirks of heterosexual men. They just enjoy knocking the living daylights out of each other. There we are. There we are. It's why the world is now run by women and gays, but still, there we are. And then, of course, there is the real thing called war, where you actually, again, according to strict principles, you kill each other, or the strict principles apply to your fellow gentlemen. They don't apply to peasants. But that's how it works. So we need, again, to imagine ourselves back into that. So Henry finally gets the war he wants, and he does it above all through having found a man who can manage politics on his behalf. It's the extraordinary story of the rise of Wolsey. Thomas Wolsey, originally brought to court by the leading surviving counsellor of Henry VII, Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester and Lord Privy Seal. And Wolsey's first letter that survives is addressed to Fox, saying, these dreadful, what I've been talking about, noblemen, these dreadful noblemen, all belonging to the house of Howard, are encouraging the king to the extravagance of war and nonsense. I'm going to do my best to stop it. P.S. And then this is characteristically Wolsey. I've got an absolute wizard idea. Why don't I make it impossible for the Earl of Surrey to remain in court? I will deprive him of lodgings, which will mean he'll have, he won't be able to stay at court. Therefore, the whole of the rest of his family will walk out in a huff. So the king won't actually be surrounded by all of this pressure, and will be able to have peace just as we used to do under Henry VII. That is how Wolsey sees things when he first comes to court. And then very quickly he realises, and again, this is something that's fascinating, he realises, and Wolsey, incidentally, is the subject of one of the very first biographies of someone who is not royal and emphatically not a saint. There are lots of biographies of saints, of course. He's the subject of one of the very first biographies by a man called George Cavendish, who'd been his gentleman usher. And the point that Cavendish picks on is what explains Wolsey having begun as an agent of a peace party, turning into a war minister. Now, how does that happen? It happens very simply because, as Cavendish says, Wolsey realises that the way to get on at court wasn't to give the king the advice that you should give him, but to give him the advice he wanted to hear. And above all, to do what enabled him to get what he wanted. Whereas if you look, of course, at the great debate over counsel and advice in Thomas More's Utopia, More is taking exactly the opposite line, that the right thing for a royal counsellor to do is to teach the king what he should do, and only to enable him to do that. It turns out, of course, to be a counsel of perfection, which not even More was able to follow, but he died for that principle, let it be recognised eventually, though there were lots of backslidings en route. But anyway, Wolsey, with recognising that it was his job to deliver what's wanted, delivers Henry War. And he delivers Henry War on a quite magnificent scale. We've forgotten just how big the wars of Henry VIII's reign are. Henry VIII's army is double that of Henry V. It's huge. The war expenditure, one summer's campaigning, is £1 million. Dear me, what sort of Alistair Darling makes every time he flips a house, isn't it, really? But then remember, gross royal revenue was just over £100,000 per year. So you blew in 10 times annual revenue on one summer's campaigning. Henry is quite good at it. I mean, the trouble is, he's not all that good. And he doesn't have all that good generals. But what they do manage to do is, again, and we've forgotten that it matters an awful lot, Henry, in that summer of campaigning, totally puts England on the map. If you look at that meeting in Cambrai, which alters the entire destinies of Europe with the League of Cambrai against Venice, England was not a signatory. It's the only great power to be excluded. There will never again be, so long as Henry and Wolsey are around, a European peace conference at which England is not one of the dominant powers. So Henry's First French War does what he wants it to do. It's fame. It puts him on the map. You also capture 2 towns. One of them you've never heard of, and there's no reason why you should, Terouanne, which is promptly knocked down, the sort of wastefulness of war. The other, which I confess I hadn't much heard of, but when I went and visited it for doing the Henry VIII television series, it's huge. Tournai was one of the largest medieval cities in northern Europe. When it was English, it was second only to London, giving you an idea of its scale. And Henry spends his absolute fortune on fortifying it. And if England had been able to hold on to Tournai, you would have had the beginnings of a real major toehold in France, rather than just the... because you'd have also... Tournai had all sorts of special rights over the ecclesiastical structure of northern France. It's an absolutely crucial commercial and trading and transport centre. It would have been the beginnings of a really serious dominion in northern France, but he can't keep it. Nevertheless, this war, the conquests that Henry makes, mean that England and Henry definitively emerges as one of the big three European powers, alongside France and alongside the Spain-Habsburg combination. And England does not lose that position from that point onwards. So Henry really has put England and himself on the map. And even Italians, even people like Castiglione and whatever, notice he's made his impact. But he has made the impact at absolutely staggering cost. Again, as America is now discovering, great power status more or less automatically entails national bankruptcy. England was virtually unique in the 18th and early 19th century in being able to fight wars at a profit, because you have such an efficient financial structure. For example, in the 18th century, the English can borrow money at between 2 and 5%. The French are regularly paying 15 to 25%, because their state credit is so poor, which is why England in the 18th century, with a population of merely 8 million less, is able to cope with France with a population already of 20 to 25. But that advantage does not apply in the early 16th century. And again, Henry then discovers that however much you may posture as a great power, you're not one. And let's get some very elementary facts into our heads. Again, one of the great problems I've talked about, history no longer including chronology. Well, geography, I'm reliably told, now no longer includes maps. But it is very, very, very important. Look at England and look at France. France is 4 times the size of England. Now they roughly level peg in terms of population. That's because we bloated with the Industrial Revolution, which is why we have such a problem with an underclass. We've got, dare one say it, lots of people who were designed for manual work, for which there is no longer any manual work. I know, I come from Oldham and the Northwest, and that terrible problem. But then it ain't so. England in the reign of Henry VIII has, figure, population, 2.5 to 2.75 million. France is already 15. The revenues of a king of France are 1 million a year. The revenues of a king of England are 120, 150,000, if he's lucky. See what I mean? There's a gross disparity. And the disparity is even greater if you look at the new conglomerate of the Habsburgs that's beginning to emerge, with Charles V, being a kind of complete European union in himself. We do realise just what the Habsburg power is. It's the New World, it's Spain, it's the Netherlands, that's both Belgium and Holland. It is large chunks of Germany. It is Austria, it is right down into the Tyrol, and it is Milan and Naples. It's most of Italy as well, and gigantic power base. And the only reason that it's not even more overwhelming than it is the very simple fact that it's very difficult to marshal and keep control of all of those countries of such different languages and different cultures. Anyway, so Henry then very quickly discovers he can fight one big war, but he can't keep on fighting war. And instead what Henry has to do, and again with Wolsey as the masterstroke of all of this, you then discover, well, there is actually an alternative to war, and it's wonderfully fashionable. It's called peace. You've got it's a novel discovery if you're a gentleman. I mean, and of course it's being written about in enthusiastic terms by Erasmus, the Julius Exclusus, and by Thomas More. It's what utopia is all about. It's alternatives to perpetual war. And look at the introduction there. So what Henry and Wolsey do, to enormous applause, is to rerun the Congress of Cambrai. But they rerun it where else but London. And instead of it being a wicked complot against Venice, it's a project for, and if Europe ever unites, Wolsey will be one of the heroic statesmen of Europe, because the Congress in London in September 1518 is the first serious attempt at a general European-wide peace settlement, with, of course, what's in it for Henry and Wolsey? Well, Henry is the guardian and Wolsey is the kind of Secretary General of this league, allegedly managing all Europe, and then and of course it's given an appropriately grandiose name. It's not just any old peace treaty. It's the universal and perpetual peace, you know. And, of course, to celebrate the universal and perpetual peace, well, what do? Well, it's called an Olympics. And it involves exactly what 2012 will do, inordinate amounts of money being poured down the drain on utterly useless temporary structures. And you all know what it's called. It's called the Field of Cloth of Gold. And the Field of Cloth of Gold is, of course, it's a summit conference. It's a meeting between Francis and Henry. But it's also an opportunity for exactly what the Olympics are, competitive expenditure in peace, and with sport acting as a surrogate for actual conflict. The whole thing centres around the gigantic jousts, and as well, of course, as the famous wrestling match between Francis I and Henry VIII, which Henry loses, and loses rather badly. But again, just to get a flavour of the utter and preposterous absurdity of the thing, once the whole thing is over, the lists, the jousting field, which, of course, is the symbol of conflict, is then, as a super symbol of peace, an altar is then erected upon it. And Wolsey, as cardinal, archbishop, legate, God only knows what else, presumably God did know what he was, but anyway, and celebrates this grand mass of the Holy Virgin. And at the summit, I don't know, have you ever noticed the wonderful painting of the Field of Cloth of Gold at Hampton Court? There is this bizarre dragon going across the top. Well, ladies and gentlemen, at the moment of consecration of the Mass, the elevation of Wolsey, you know, hoc est corpus and all the rest of it. The moment of the consecration, what happens is this gigantic firework is let off and shoots across the stage, and of course most of the people there collapse on their knees thinking that it's the Holy Ghost, which has actually appeared in the form of a firework. As I said, there is this extraordinary combination of absurdity and high intention. But what you're doing is you're making peace interesting. You're making it glorious. You're making it ostentatious. You're making it a vehicle for national expression, competition in peace. Well, it lasts about 6 months. And you then go into another war, which proves to be utterly catastrophic for England, though Henry doesn't realise it at the time, because in this war, Charles V, the young Habsburg, flattens Francis I of France at the Battle of Pavia, actually captures him, and at this point takes control of Italy, which he never loses. So, Henry thought this was wonderful because Charles was his ally. When the messenger comes announcing that the victory of Pavia and that Francis I has been captured, he is received by Henry, as the messenger comments, as though he'd been the angel Gabriel. Announcing the coming of Christ and all this. Henry thinks, at last, now I've really got France. Now I can really be Henry V. The King of France is captured, just as King John had been captured under Edward III and all the rest of it. Charles V rather coolly sends a little note back saying this was an extremely interesting idea, but would Henry please take the initiative in raising the army to conquer France? And so that is then scrubbed, and you can see what's now happened. Henry really, despite having put England on the map, hasn't been another Henry V. The grand project of peace has led only to the domination of the whole continent of Europe by the Habsburg power. And of course, Henry at this stage hasn't even got an heir. because Catherine has only given birth to Mary. And therefore, by 1527, and particularly when, in response to that challenge of Charles V, Henry really does try to raise an army to conquer France, but he's gone back to Parliament so often to get finance for these fantastic schemes of war and peace that he and Wolsey decide you can't actually go back to Parliament again, so you try a scheme for extra parliamentary taxation. And the English, who in those days were used actually to freedom, unlike the supine English now, say no vote in Parliament, we won't give you money. And so Henry has to reap the double humiliation of seeing Charles V triumphant against France, but also of being unable to participate in that victory because his people won't actually let him raise troops. They won't raise the taxation, which will alone let him raise troops. So in other words, I think Henry, by the middle of the 1520s, this deeply conventional king, had played out all the conventions. You haven't been terribly successful as a warrior. You haven't been great shakes at the newfangled scheme of European peacemaking, although, of course, you do have one final fling of it in 1527 when there is yet another compact between England and France, really directed against the Emperor Charles V, and Wolsey and Francis I of France actually meet. And, of course, the great difficulty was having once called a peace treaty, the Treaty of Universal and Perpetual Peace. If it's failed, how do you go one better? Well, trust Wolsey to do it. The peace treaties of 1527, the treaties of Amiens, are hailed as the Treaty of Eternal Peace, Pax Eterna, and the two participating kings appear as God the Father and God the Son, depending on which side of the channel you are, and Wolsey, of course, is the Holy Ghost, quite seriously, acting as mediator between the two, but it's all, by this time, a bit of a farce, and is generally recognised to be a farce. And this is the moment, of course, that the Henry is really at the end of his tether. In 1528, there's an extremely bad bout of sweating sickness. It strikes into the very heart of Henry's court. Several members of his privy chamber are infected. Quite a few of them die, including his great favourite, William Compton, the groom of the stool. Now, Henry thought he was going to die. He's busily engaged in making wills and all the rest of it. If Henry had died at that point, after a reign of 19 years, we would never have heard of him. He would be another failed late medieval king. He would be of no significance whatever. He would also have ushered in a catastrophic civil war because he had only left a daughter, unmarried at that point. It would have been an absolutely disastrous reign. And then what happens is things really do fall to pieces because Henry, at exactly this moment, in late 1526, early 1527, there is this extraordinary affair with Anne Boleyn, this young woman brought up in the French world of the Netherlands and the French court itself, who returns to England, catches Henry's eye and sweeps him off his feet. And the letter that we have at the heart of the exhibition here is the love letter that Henry writes in response to hers. Hers had accompanied une étrenne, a New Year's Day gift for January the 1st, 1527. Gifts are given at New Year, not on Christmas Day in those days. And Anne had offered herself effectively to marry Henry. Henry takes her up on that and pledges to marry her, come what may. He actually, he said he uses Latin phrases in the letter, which means either that or nothing. It is my immovable, he's writing in French, it is my immovable intention to marry you. Now, that should have been a catastrophe. She was totally unworthy as a queen. It would have involved a massive rupture with the Habsburgs. It did involve a massive rupture with the Habsburgs. She was a mere courtier's daughter. She was also, bizarrely, the sister of a discarded mistress of Mary Boleyn. The whole thing was an absurd, preposterous notion. Henry, of course, thought it was going to be relatively easy and cheap to do because the Pope owed him one, as part, again, of this intense Well, you've seen the Pope and Margaret Thatcher, the chumminess of power, and wearing funny hats, the kind of funny papal hat and the mantilla. Henry, as part of this profound conventionality, in 1521, as the response to the full broadside from Martin Luther, had written the great defence of papal power, the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, in return for which he gets the title of Defensor Fidei, of Defender of the Faith, and he assumes that, once he actually wants a divorce and once he wants another marriage, he assumes in a sense that the title of Fidei Defensor is a sort of down payment. And remember, he's got ample reason for doing so. If you look at the last two kings of France, Charles VIII and Louis XII, they are both divorced in order to remarry the same woman. That's the Duchess Anne of Brittany, to keep Brittany into the French crown. And Rome had a perfectly adequate series of formulae. It was to guarantee peace, which is incidentally the only reason that Henry had been allowed to marry Catherine, who was, after all, his sister-in-law, in the first place. It's to guarantee peace. It's the Pope's general duty to ensure peace amongst the Christian powers. So Henry he was an arguable case. But, of course, catastrophically, We've heard about Charles V taking effective control of North Italy at Pavia. He does more than take effective control of North Italy. A few months after, Henry and Anne have pledged their troth, after, in fact, Wolsey has had an abortive hearing of Henry's marriage and proposal to remarry. The troops of the Emperor Charles V, led by a great renegade French nobleman, the Connétable de Bourbon, sack Rome. And they hold Rome. The Pope is forced to flee, first to the Castel Sant'Angelo and then to Civitavecchia, Orvieto, not Civitavecchia. Orvieto is forced to flee to Orvieto, and the Pope at that point, at exactly the moment that Henry is asking for divorce from Catherine of Aragon, her nephew holds the Pope and Italy in the palm of his hand. It's a total catastrophe. Anne Boleyn understands the circumstances immediately. It takes Henry and Wolsey 2 years. I actually think Wolsey is enormously overrated as a diplomatist, but that's another very different matter. And finally, in 1529, Henry has to realise, when there's a second trial of the divorce in England before Wolsey and another papal legate, Cardinal Campeggio, the Cardinal Protector of England, Henry has to realise he will not get his divorce from Rome, though he still continues knocking increasingly vainly at the door. But in these years, something else happens. Henry, I think first impelled by Anne, but increasingly by his own volition, comes to realise if Rome won't do it, another way will have to be found. And in practice, the only other way is to do it in defiance of Rome, is actually to usurp Rome, is to declare not only that the text of the Bible renders marriage to a sister-in-law absolutely incestuous and sinful, but also that Rome has got no right to try the case, because Rome has no special privilege over the church. There is no such thing as a universal church. There are only individual national churches, and the obvious head of those individual national churches is the sovereign of each nation, and particularly in England, which is God's own nation anyway, with God's own king, Henry. And this extraordinary argument, which is serious and is seriously believed, you are sitting on top of it. This library contains the actual documents. The core of this library is Henry's library. And Henry's library is transformed to enable him and his think tank to come up with this argument. The Royal Library, before Henry, is, I don't know how many of you have been privileged to have dinner at Windsor. If you go to Windsor now and you have dinner, after you've had dinner, for your delectation, precious volumes of the Royal Library will be put out in what was formerly Queen Elizabeth I's bedroom and gallery for your delectation. And you spite them there chattering, admiring the bindings and the beautiful texts and the illuminations. In other words, at the risk of being controversial, this is a library for people who don't read. Exactly the same thing is true of the medieval Royal Library. What are book illuminations for? They're the equivalent of Sunday supplements. Right? As you admire pictures of Jimmy Choo's shoes and all the rest, that, and medieval illuminations seem to me to be very much of the same sort of thing. Well, that was what the Royal Library was. Henry absolutely transforms it into a real working library of several thousand volumes, which is arranged alphabetically, which is catalogued using Arabic numbers, which is cross-referenced, which has the equivalent of a card index. And go into the exhibition and look at it. It's called the Collectanea Satis Copiosa, which can be said, I suppose, it can be translated as the collection that says it all. And it's the cross-referenced set of texts lifted from these books and marked in the margins, cross-referenced to them and whatever, that argues the case against Henry's marriage and for his headship of the church. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we've got to get into our heads is that this is infinitely revolutionary. There is no precedent for it at all. It stands history totally on its head. It breaks Henry's coronation oath. It also repudiates everything that he believed in himself only 6 years earlier, when he'd written the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum. It denies the things that he had done when he was a young man in front of the Ushaw prayer roll that we have in this exhibition here. It is a process of revolutionary change in an individual. And this seems to me, this is the change. It's not having a knock on the head. It's undergoing this process of radical shift of oneself. Now, does Henry believe it? I've before used the comparison between Henry VIII and Tony Blair, and I will use it again. All the best liars believe their own lies. I make no further comment. But there was a wonderful exchange between Blair and William Hague, much underrated man, I think. And Hague was teasing Blair about the fact, of course, that before New Labour was invented, God, what an invention that's been, before New Labour was invented, Blair had been a left-wing CND supporting MP. Right on the far left of the Labour Party. And Hague sort of teases him on this, and Blair comes back in characteristic Blair fashion. No, come on, do you believe? That kind of little, the illusion at that point, there must be a glottal stop in it somewhere, doesn't it? You kind of believe everything you believed in 1988. Hague comes back like a flash. Prime Minister, do you believe anything you believed in 1988? And Henry is exactly that. There is that kind of flip. And I think that at that point, the only test becomes, do you follow Henry down this path or don't you? If you don't, you're lost. If you do, you're fine. If you follow Henry down the path, if you follow Henry down the path of change, you're saved. You are his. If you don't, you're a traitor. And we know what the penalty of traitors is. This is the change. This is the transformation. Everything flows from that. Thank you. That's the end. Yes, right.